The operation lasted 2 hours, and then not only the case, with its valve, its springs, its brasswork, lay on the ground, but the net, that is to say a considerable quantity of ropes and cordage, and the circle and the anchor. The case, except for the fracture, was in good condition, only the lower portion being torn. A wreck in the air, a wreck in the air. It was a fortune which had fallen from the sky. All the same, Captain, said the sailor, if we ever decide to leave the island, it won't be in a balloon, will it? These airboats won't go where we want them to go, and we have had some experience in that way. Look here, we will build a craft of some 20 tons, and then we can make a mainsail, a foresail, and a jib out of that cloth. As to the rest of it, that will help to dress us. We shall see, Pencroft, replied Cyrus Harding, we shall see. In the meantime, we must put it in a safe place, said Neb. They certainly could not think of carrying this load of cloth, ropes, and cordage to Granite House, for the weight of it was very considerable, and whilst waiting for a suitable vehicle in which to convey it, it was of importance that this treasure should not be left longer exposed to the mercies of the first storm. The settlers, uniting their efforts, managed to drag it as far as the shore, where they discovered a large rocky cavity, which, owing to its position, could not be visited either by the wind or rain. We needed a locker, and now we have one, said Pencroft, but as we cannot lock it up, it will be prudent to hide the opening. I don't mean from two-legged thieves, but from those with 4 paws. At 6 o'clock, all was stowed away, and after having given the creek the very suitable name of Port Balloon, the settlers pursued their way along Claw Cape. Pencroft and the engineer talked of the different projects, which it was agreed to put into execution with the briefest possible delay. It was necessary first of all to throw a bridge over the Mersey, so as to establish an easy communication with the south of the island. Then the cart must be taken to bring back the balloon, for the canoe alone could not carry it. Then they would build a decked boat, and Pencroft would rig it as a cutter, and they would be able to undertake voyages of circumnavigation round the island, etc. In the meanwhile night came on, and it was already dark when the settlers reached Flotsam Point, the place where they had discovered the precious chest. The distance between Flotsam Point and Granite House was another 4 miles, and it was midnight when, after having followed the shore to the mouth of the Mersey, the settlers arrived at the first angle formed by the Mersey. Now, the river was 80 feet in breadth, which was awkward to cross, but as Pencroft had taken upon himself to conquer this difficulty, he was compelled to do it. The settlers certainly had reason to be pretty tired. The journey had been long, and the task of getting down the balloon had not rested either their arms or legs. They were anxious to reach Granite House to eat and sleep, and if the bridge had been constructed, in a quarter of an hour they would have been at home. The night was very dark. Pencroft prepared to keep his promise by constructing a sort of raft on which to make the passage of the Mersey. He and Neb, armed with axes, chose 2 trees near the water and began to attack them at the base. Cyrus Harding and Spilett, seated on the bank, waited till their companions were ready for their help, whilst Herbert roamed about, though without going to any distance. All at once, the lad who had strolled by the river came running back, and pointing up the Mersey, exclaimed, "What is floating there?" Pencroft stopped working, and seeing an indistinct object moving through the gloom. "A canoe!" cried he. All approached, and saw to their extreme surprise a boat floating down the current. "Boat ahoy!" shouted the sailor, without thinking that perhaps it would be best to keep silence. No reply. The boat still drifted onwards, and it was not more than 12 feet off when the sailor exclaimed, "But it is our own boat. She has broken her moorings and floated down the current. I must say she has arrived very opportunely." "Our boat," murmured the engineer. Pencroft was right. It was indeed the canoe, of which the rope had undoubtedly broken, and which had come alone from the sources of the Mersey. It was very important to seize it before the rapid current should have swept it away out of the mouth of the river, but Neb and Pencroft cleverly managed this by means of a long pole. The canoe touched the shore. The engineer leapt in first, and found, on examining the rope, that it had been really worn through by rubbing against the rocks. "Well," said the reporter to him in a low voice, "this is a strange thing." "Strange indeed," returned Cyrus Harding. "Strange or not, it was very fortunate." Herbert, the reporter, Neb, and Pencroft embarked in turn. There was no doubt about the rope having been worn through, but the astonishing part of the affair was that the boat should have arrived just at the moment when the settlers were there to seize it on its way. For a quarter of an hour earlier or later, it would have been lost in the sea. If they had been living in the time of genii, this incident would have given them the right to think that the island was haunted by some supernatural being, who used his power in the service of the castaways. A few strokes of the oar brought the settlers to the mouth of the Mersey. The canoe was hauled up on the beach near the Chimneys, and all proceeded towards the ladder of Granite House. But at that moment, Top barked angrily, and Neb, who was looking for the first steps, uttered a cry. There was no longer a ladder. There was no longer a ladder. There was no longer a ladder. Chapter 6. Pencroft's halloos, a night in the Chimneys, Herbert's arrows, the captain's project, an unexpected explanation, what has happened in Granite House, how a new servant enters the service of the colonists. Cyrus Harding stood still without saying a word. His companions searched in the darkness on the wall, in case the wind should have moved the ladder, and on the ground, thinking that it might have fallen down, but the ladder had quite disappeared. As to ascertaining if a squall had blown it on to the landing place, halfway up, that was impossible in the dark. "If it is a joke," cried Pencroft, "it is a very stupid one, to come home and find no staircase to go up to your room by. For weary men, there is nothing to laugh at, that I can see." Neb could do nothing but cry out, "Oh, oh, oh." "I begin to think that very curious things happen in Lincoln Island," said Pencroft. "Curious," replied Gideon Spilett. "Not at all, Pencroft. Nothing can be more natural. Someone has come during our absence, taken possession of our dwelling, and drawn up the ladder." "Someone," cried the sailor, "but who?" "Who but the hunter who fired the bullet?" replied the reporter. "Well, if there is anyone up there," replied Pencroft, who began to lose patience, "I will give them a hail, and they must answer." And in a stentorian voice, the sailor gave a prolonged halloo, which was echoed again and again from the cliff and rocks. The settlers listened, and they thought they heard a sort of chuckling laugh, of which they could not guess the origin. But no voice replied to Pencroft, who in vain repeated his vigorous shouts. There was something indeed in this to astonish the most apathetic of men, and the settlers were not men of that description. In their situation, every incident had its importance, and certainly, during the 7 months which they had spent on the island, they had not before met with anything of so surprising a character. Be that as it may, forgetting their fatigue in the singularity of the event, they remained below Granite House, not knowing what to think, not knowing what to do, questioning each other without any hope of a satisfactory reply, every one starting some supposition, each more unlikely than the last. Neb bewailed himself, much disappointed at not being able to get into his kitchen, for the provisions which they had had on their expedition were exhausted, and they had no means of renewing them. "My friends," at last said Cyrus Harding, "there is only one thing to be done at present: wait for day, and then act according to circumstances. But let us go to the Chimneys. There we shall be under shelter, and if we cannot eat, we can at least sleep." "But who is it that has played us this cool trick?" again asked Pencroft, unable to make up his mind to retire from the spot. Whoever it was, the only thing practicable was to do as the engineer proposed, to go to the Chimneys and there wait for day. In the meanwhile, Top was ordered to mount guard below the windows of Granite House, and when Top received an order, he obeyed it without any questioning. The brave dog therefore remained at the foot of the cliff, whilst his master with his companions sought a refuge among the rocks. To say that the settlers, notwithstanding their fatigue, slept well on the sandy floor of the Chimneys would not be true. It was not only that they were extremely anxious to find out the cause of what had happened, whether it was the result of an accident which would be discovered at the return of day, or whether, on the contrary, it was the work of a human being, but they also had very uncomfortable beds. That could not be helped, however, for in some way or other at that moment their dwelling was occupied, and they could not possibly enter it. Now Granite House was more than their dwelling, it was their warehouse. There were all the stores belonging to the colony, weapons, instruments, tools, ammunition, provisions, etc. To think that all that might be pillaged, and that the settlers would have all their work to do over again, fresh weapons and tools to make, was a serious matter. Their uneasiness led one or other of them also to go out every few minutes to see if Top was keeping good watch. Cyrus Harding alone waited with his habitual patience, although his strong mind was exasperated at being confronted with such an inexplicable fact, and he was provoked at himself for allowing a feeling to which he could not give a name to gain an influence over him. Gideon Spilett shared his feelings in this respect, and the two conversed together in whispers of the inexplicable circumstance which baffled even their intelligence and experience. "It is a joke," said Pencroft. "It is a trick someone has played us. Well, I don't like such jokes, and the joker had better look out for himself. If he falls into my hands, I can tell him." As soon as the first gleam of light appeared in the east, the colonists, suitably armed, repaired to the beach under Granite House. The rising sun now shone on the cliff, and they could see the windows, the shutters of which were closed, through the curtains of foliage. All here was in order, but a cry escaped the colonists when they saw that the door, which they had closed on their departure, was now wide open. Someone had entered Granite House, there could be no more doubt about that. The upper ladder, which generally hung from the door to the landing, was in its place, but the lower ladder was drawn up and raised to the threshold. It was evident that the intruders had wished to guard themselves against a surprise. Pencroft hailed again. No reply. "The beggars," exclaimed the sailor. "There they are, sleeping quietly as if they were in their own house. Hallo there, you pirates, brigands, robbers, sons of John Bull." When Pencroft, being a Yankee, treated anyone to the epithet of son of John Bull, he considered he had reached the last limits of insult. The sun had now completely risen, and the whole facade of Granite House became illuminated by his rays, but in the interior, as well as on the exterior, all was quiet and calm. The settlers asked if Granite House was inhabited or not, and yet the position of the ladder was sufficient to show that it was. It was also certain that the inhabitants, whoever they might be, had not been able to escape. But how were they to be got at? Herbert then thought of fastening a cord to an arrow, and shooting the arrow so that it should pass between the first rounds of the ladder which hung from the threshold. By means of the cord, they would then be able to draw down the ladder to the ground, and so re-establish the communication between the beach and Granite House. There was evidently nothing else to be done, and with a little skill, this method might succeed. Very fortunately, bows and arrows had been left at the chimneys, where they also found a quantity of light hibiscus cord. Pencroft fastened this to a well-feathered arrow. Then Herbert, fixing it to his bow, took a careful aim for the lower part of the ladder. Cyrus Harding, Gideon Spilett, Pencroft, and Neb drew back so as to see if anything appeared at the windows. The reporter lifted his gun to his shoulder and covered the door. The bow was bent, the arrow flew, taking the cord with it, and passed between the two last rounds. The operation had succeeded. Herbert immediately seized the end of the cord, but at that moment, when he gave it a pull to bring down the ladder, an arm, thrust suddenly out between the wall and the door, grasped it and dragged it inside Granite House. "The rascals!" shouted the sailor. "If a ball can do anything for you, you shall not have long to wait for it." "But who was it?" asked Neb. "Who was it, didn't you see?" "No." "It was a monkey, a sapago, an orang-outang, a baboon, a gorilla, a sagan. Our dwelling has been invaded by monkeys who climbed up the ladder during our absence." And at this moment, as if to bear witness to the truth of the sailor's words, 2 or 3 quadrumana showed themselves at the windows, from which they had pushed back the shutters, and saluted the real proprietors of the place with 1,000 hideous grimaces. "I knew that it was only a joke," cried Pencroft, "but one of the jokers shall pay the penalty for the rest." So saying, the sailor, raising his piece, took a rapid aim at one of the monkeys and fired. All disappeared, except one who fell mortally wounded on the beach. This monkey, which was of a large size, evidently belonged to the first order of the quadrumana. Whether this was a chimpanzee, an orang-outan, or a gorilla, he took rank among the anthropoid apes, who are so called from their resemblance to the human race. However, Herbert declared it to be an orang-outan. "What a magnificent beast!" cried Neb. "Magnificent, if you like," replied Pencroft, "but still, I do not see how we are to get into our house." "Herbert is a good marksman," said the reporter, "and his bow is here. He can try again." "Why, these apes are so cunning," returned Pencroft. "They won't show themselves again at the windows, and so we can't kill them. And when I think of the mischief they may do in the rooms and storehouse." "Have patience," replied Harding. "These creatures cannot keep us long at bay." "I shall not be sure of that till I see them down here," replied the sailor. "And now, Captain, do you know how many dozens of these fellows are up there?" It was difficult to reply to Pencroft, and as for the young boy making another attempt, that was not easy, for the lower part of the ladder had been drawn again into the door, and when another pull was given, the line broke and the ladder remained firm. The case was really perplexing. Pencroft stormed. There was a comic side to the situation, but he did not think it funny at all. It was certain that the settlers would end by reinstating themselves in their domicile and driving out the intruders, but when and how, that is what they were not able to say. The invaders of Granite House, the invaders of Granite House. 2 hours passed, during which the apes took care not to show themselves, but they were still there, and 3 or 4 times a nose or a paw was poked out at the door or windows, and was immediately saluted by a gunshot. "Let us hide ourselves," at last said the engineer. "Perhaps the apes will think we have gone quite away and will show themselves again. Let Spilett and Herbert conceal themselves behind those rocks and fire on all that may appear." The engineer's orders were obeyed, and whilst the reporter and the lad, the best marksmen in the colony, posted themselves in a good position, but out of the monkey's sight, Neb, Pencroft, and Cyrus climbed the plateau and entered the forest in order to kill some game, for it was now time for breakfast, and they had no provisions remaining. In half an hour the hunters returned with a few rock pigeons, which they roasted as well as they could. Not an ape had appeared. Gideon Spilett and Herbert went to take their share of the breakfast, leaving Top to watch under the windows. They then, having eaten, returned to their post. 2 hours later, their situation was in no degree improved. The quadrumana gave no sign of existence, and it might have been supposed that they had disappeared. But what seemed more probable was that, terrified by the death of one of their companions and frightened by the noise of the firearms, they had retreated to the back part of the house or probably even into the storeroom. And when they thought of the valuables which this storeroom contained, the patience so much recommended by the engineer fast changed into great irritation, and there certainly was room for it. "Decidedly it is too bad," said the reporter, "and the worst of it is, there is no way of putting an end to it." "But we must drive these vagabonds out somehow," cried the sailor. "We could soon get the better of them, even if there are 20 of the rascals, but for that, we must meet them hand to hand. Come now, is there no way of getting at them?" "Let us try to enter Granite House by the old opening at the lake," replied the engineer. "Oh," shouted the sailor, "and I never thought of that." This was in reality the only way by which to penetrate into Granite House so as to fight with and drive out the intruders. The opening was, it is true, closed up with a wall of cemented stones, which it would be necessary to sacrifice, but that could easily be rebuilt. Fortunately, Cyrus Harding had not as yet effected his project of hiding this opening by raising the waters of the lake, for the operation would then have taken some time. It was already past 12 o'clock when the colonists, well armed and provided with picks and spades, left the chimneys, passed beneath the windows of Granite House, after telling Top to remain at his post, and began to ascend the left bank of the Mersey, so as to reach Prospect Heights. But they had not made 50 steps in this direction when they heard the dog barking furiously. And all rushed down the bank again. Arrived at the turning, they saw that the situation had changed. In fact, the apes, seized with a sudden panic from some unknown cause, were trying to escape. 2 or 3 ran and clambered from one window to another with the agility of acrobats. They were not even trying to replace the ladder, by which it would have been easy to descend. Perhaps in their terror they had forgotten this way of escape. The colonists, now being able to take aim without difficulty, fired. Some, wounded or killed, fell back into the rooms, uttering piercing cries. The rest, throwing themselves out, were dashed to pieces in their fall, and in a few minutes, so far as they knew, there was not a living quadrumana in Granite House. At this moment, the ladder was seen to slip over the threshold, then unroll and fall to the ground. "Hullo," cried the sailor, "this is queer." "Very strange," murmured the engineer, leaping first up the ladder. "Take care, Captain," cried Pencroft, "perhaps there are still some of these rascals." "We shall soon see," replied the engineer, without stopping, however. All his companions followed him, and in a minute they had arrived at the threshold. They searched everywhere. There was no one in the rooms nor in the storehouse, which had been respected by the band of quadrumana. "Well now, and the ladder," cried the sailor, "who can the gentleman have been who sent us that down?" But at that moment a cry was heard, and a great orang, who had hidden himself in the passage, rushed into the room, pursued by Neb. "Ah, the robber!" cried Pencroft. And hatchet in hand, he was about to cleave the head of the animal, when Cyrus Harding seized his arm, saying, "Spare him, Pencroft. Pardon this rascal. Yes, it was he who threw us the ladder." And the engineer said this in such a peculiar voice that it was difficult to know whether he spoke seriously or not. Nevertheless, they threw themselves on the orang, who defended himself gallantly, but was soon overpowered and bound. "There," said Pencroft, "and what shall we make of him now we've got him?" "A servant," replied Herbert. The lad was not joking in saying this, for he knew how this intelligent race could be turned to account. The settlers then approached the ape and gazed at it attentively. He belonged to the family of anthropoid apes, of which the facial angle is not much inferior to that of the Australians and Hottentots. It was an orang-outang, and as such, had neither the ferocity of the gorilla nor the stupidity of the baboon. It is to this family of the anthropoid apes that so many characteristics belong which prove them to be possessed of an almost human intelligence. Employed in houses, they can wait at table, sweep rooms, brush clothes, clean boots, handle a knife, fork, and spoon properly, and even drink wine, doing everything as well as the best servant that ever walked upon 2 legs. Buffon possessed one of these apes, who served him for a long time as a faithful and zealous servant. Capturing the orang, capturing the orang. The one which had been seized in the hall of Granite House was a great fellow, 6 feet high, with an admirably proportioned frame, a broad chest, head of a moderate size, the facial angle reaching 65 degrees, round skull, projecting nose, skin covered with soft glossy hair, in short, a fine specimen of the anthropoids. His eyes, rather smaller than human eyes, sparkled with intelligence, his white teeth glittered under his mustache, and he wore a little curly brown beard. "A handsome fellow," said Pencroft. "If we only knew his language, we could talk to him." "But, master," said Neb, "are you serious? Are we going to take him as a servant?" "Yes, Neb," replied the engineer, smiling, "but you must not be jealous." "And I hope he will make an excellent servant," added Herbert. "He appears young, and will be easy to educate, and we shall not be obliged to use force to subdue him, nor draw his teeth, as is sometimes done. He will soon grow fond of his masters if they are kind to him." "And they will be," replied Pencroft, who had forgotten all his rancor against the jokers. Then, approaching the orang, "Well, old boy," he asked, "how are you?" The orang replied by a little grunt, which did not show any anger. "You wish to join the colony?" again asked the sailor. you are going to enter the service of Captain Cyrus Harding." Another respondent grunt was uttered by the ape. "And you will be satisfied with no other wages than your food." Third affirmative grunt. "This conversation is slightly monotonous," observed Gideon Spilett. "So much the better," replied Pencroft. "The best servants are those who talk the least. And then, no wages, do you hear, my boy? We will give you no wages at first, but we will double them afterwards if we are pleased with you." Thus the colony was increased by a new member. As to his name, the sailor begged that in memory of another ape which he had known, he might be called Jupiter, and Jup for short. And so, without more ceremony, Master Jup was installed in Granite House. Engaging the new servant, engaging the new servant. Chapter 7. Plans a bridge over the Mersey, mode adopted for making an island of Prospect Heights, the drawbridge harvest, the stream, the poultry yard, a pigeon house, the 2 onagas, the cart, excursion to Port Balloon. The settlers in Lincoln Island had now regained their dwelling, without having been obliged to reach it by the old opening, and were therefore spared the trouble of mason's work. It was certainly lucky that at the moment they were about to set out to do so, the apes had been seized with that terror, no less sudden than inexplicable, which had driven them out of Granite House. Had the animals discovered that they were about to be attacked from another direction? This was the only explanation of their sudden retreat. During the day, the bodies of the apes were carried into the wood, where they were buried. Then the settlers busied themselves in repairing the disorder caused by the intruders, disorder but not damage, for although they had turned everything in the rooms topsy-turvy, yet they had broken nothing. Neb relighted his stove, and the stores in the larder furnished a substantial repast, to which all did ample justice. Jup was not forgotten, and he ate with relish some stone pine almonds and rhizome roots, with which he was abundantly supplied. Pencroft had unfastened his arms, but judged it best to have his legs tied until they were more sure of his submission. Then, before retiring to rest, Harding and his companions, seated round their table, discussed those plans, the execution of which was most pressing. The most important and most urgent was the establishment of a bridge over the Mersey, so as to form a communication with the southern part of the island and Granite House, then the making of an enclosure for the musmons or other woolly animals which they wished to capture. These 2 projects would help to solve the difficulty as to their clothing, which was now serious. The bridge would render easy the transport of the balloon case, which would furnish them with linen, and the inhabitants of the enclosure would yield wool, which would supply them with winter clothes. As to the enclosure, it was Cyrus Harding's intention to establish it at the sources of the Red Creek, where the ruminants would find fresh and abundant pasture. The road between Prospect Heights and the sources of the stream was already partly beaten, and with a better cart than the first, the material could be easily conveyed to the spot, especially if they could manage to capture some animals to draw it. But though there might be no inconvenience in the enclosure being so far from Granite House, it would not be the same with the poultry yard, to which Neb called the attention of the colonists. It was indeed necessary that the birds should be close within reach of the cook, and no place appeared more favorable for the establishment of the said poultry yard than that portion of the banks of the lake, which was close to the old opening. Water birds would prosper there as well as others, and the couple of tinamous taken in their last excursion would be the first to be domesticated. The next day, the 3rd of November, the new works were begun by the construction of the bridge, and all hands were required for this important task. Saws, hatchets, and hammers were shouldered by the settlers, who, now transformed into carpenters, descended to the shore. There Pencroft observed, "Suppose that during our absence, Master Jup takes it into his head to draw up the ladder which he so politely returned to us yesterday." "Let us tie its lower end down firmly," replied Cyrus Harding. This was done by means of 2 stakes securely fixed in the sand. Then the settlers, ascending the left bank of the Mersey, soon arrived at the angle formed by the river. There they halted in order to ascertain if the bridge could be thrown across. The place appeared suitable. In fact, from this spot to Port Balloon, discovered the day before on the southern coast, there was only a distance of 3.5 miles, and from the bridge to the port, it would be easy to make a good cart road, which would render the communication between Granite House and the south of the island extremely easy. Cyrus Harding now imparted to his companions a scheme for completely isolating Prospect Heights so as to shelter it from the attacks both of quadrupeds and quadrumana. In this way, Granite House, the chimneys, the poultry yard, and all the upper part of the plateau which was to be used for cultivation would be protected against the depredations of animals. Nothing could be easier than to execute this project, and this is how the engineer intended to set to work. The plateau was already defended on 3 sides by watercourses, either artificial or natural. On the northwest, by the shores of Lake Grant, from the entrance of the passage to the breach made in the banks of the lake for the escape of the water. On the north, from this breach to the sea, by the new watercourse, which had hollowed out a bed for itself across the plateau and shore, above and below the fall, and it would be enough to dig the bed of this creek a little deeper to make it impracticable for animals, on all the eastern border by the sea itself, from the mouth of the aforesaid creek to the mouth of the Mersey. Lastly, on the south, from the mouth to the turn of the Mersey, where the bridge was to be established. The western border of the plateau now remained between the turn of the river and the southern angle of the lake, a distance of about a mile, which was open to all comers. But nothing could be easier than to dig a broad, deep ditch, which could be filled from the lake, and the overflow of which would throw itself by a rapid fall into the bed of the Mersey. The level of the lake would, no doubt, be somewhat lowered by this fresh discharge of its waters, but Cyrus Harding had ascertained that the volume of water in the Red Creek was considerable enough to allow of the execution of this project. Building the bridge, building the bridge. So then, added the engineer, Prospect Heights will become a regular island, being surrounded with water on all sides, and only communicating with the rest of our domain by the bridge which we are about to throw across the Mersey, the 2 little bridges already established, above and below the fall, and lastly, 2 other little bridges which must be constructed, one over the canal which I propose to dig, the other across to the left bank of the Mersey. Now, if these bridges can be raised at will, Prospect Heights will be guarded from any surprise. The bridge was the most urgent work. Trees were selected, cut down, stripped of their branches, and cut into beams, joists, and planks. The end of the bridge, which rested on the right bank of the Mersey, was to be firm, but the other end on the left bank was to be movable, so that it might be raised by means of a counterpoise, as some canal bridges are managed. This was certainly a considerable work, and though it was skillfully conducted, it took some time, for the Mersey at this place was 80 feet wide. It was therefore necessary to fix piles in the bed of the river so as to sustain the floor of the bridge and establish a pile driver to act on the tops of these piles, which would thus form 2 arches and allow the bridge to support heavy loads. Happily, there was no want of tools with which to shape the wood, nor of ironwork to make it firm, nor of the ingenuity of a man who had a marvelous knowledge of the work, nor, lastly, the zeal of his companions, who in 7 months had necessarily acquired great skill in the use of their tools, and it must be said that not the least skillful was Gideon Spilett, who in dexterity almost equaled the sailor himself. Who would ever have expected so much from a newspaper man, thought Pencroft. The construction of the Mersey Bridge lasted 3 weeks of regular hard work. They even breakfasted on the scene of their labors, and the weather being magnificent, they only returned to Granite House to sleep. During this period, it may be stated that Master Jup grew more accustomed to his new masters, whose movements he always watched with very inquisitive eyes. However, as a precautionary measure, Pencroft did not as yet allow him complete liberty, rightly wishing to wait until the limits of the plateau should be settled by the projected works. Top and Jup were good friends and played willingly together, but Jup did everything solemnly. On the 20th of November, the bridge was finished. The movable part, balanced by the counterpoise, swung easily, and only a slight effort was needed to raise it. Between its hinge and the last crossbar on which it rested when closed, there existed a space of 20 feet, which was sufficiently wide to prevent any animals from crossing. The settlers now began to talk of fetching the balloon case, which they were anxious to place in perfect security, but to bring it, it would be necessary to take a cart to Port Balloon, and consequently necessary to beat a road through the dense forests of the far west. This would take some time. Also, Neb and Pencroft having gone to examine into the state of things at Port Balloon, and reported that the stock of cloth would suffer no damage in the grotto where it was stored, it was decided that the work at Prospect Heights should not be discontinued. That, observed Pencroft, will enable us to establish our poultry yard under better conditions, since we need have no fear of visits from foxes nor the attacks of other beasts. Then, added Neb, we can clear the plateau and transplant wild plants to it. And prepare our second cornfield, cried the sailor with a triumphant air. In fact, the first cornfield sown with a single grain had prospered admirably, thanks to Pencroft's care. It had produced the 10 ears foretold by the engineer, and each ear containing 80 grains. The colony found itself in possession of 800 grains in 6 months, which promised a double harvest each year. These 800 grains, except 50, which were prudently reserved, were to be sown in a new field, but with no less care than was bestowed on the single grain. The field was prepared, then surrounded with a strong palisade, high and pointed, which quadrupeds would have found difficulty in leaping. As to birds, some scarecrows, due to Pencroft's ingenious brain, were enough to frighten them. The 750 grains, deposited in very regular furrows, were then left for nature to do the rest. On the 21st of November, Cyrus Harding began to plan the canal which was to close the plateau on the west, from the south angle of Lake Grant to the angle of the Mersey. There was there 2 or 3 feet of vegetable earth, and below that granite. It was therefore necessary to manufacture some more nitroglycerine, and the nitroglycerine did its accustomed work. In less than a fortnight, a ditch 12 feet wide and 6 deep was dug out in the hard ground of the plateau. A new trench was made by the same means in the rocky border of the lake, forming a small stream, to which they gave the name of Creek Glycerine, and which was thus an affluent of the Mersey. As the engineer had predicted, the level of the lake was lowered, though very slightly. To complete the enclosure, the bed of the stream on the beach was considerably enlarged, and the sand supported by means of stakes. By the end of the first fortnight of December, these works were finished, and Prospect Heights, that is to say, a sort of irregular pentagon having a perimeter of nearly 4 miles, surrounded by a liquid belt, was completely protected from depredators of every description. During the month of December, the heat was very great. In spite of it, however, the settlers continued their work, and as they were anxious to possess a poultry yard, they forthwith commenced it. It is useless to say that since the enclosing of the plateau had been completed, Master Jup had been set at liberty. He did not leave his masters, and evinced no wish to escape. He was a gentle animal, though very powerful and wonderfully active. He was already taught to make himself useful by drawing loads of wood and carting away the stones which were extracted from the bed of Creek Glycerine. The poultry yard occupied an area of 200 square yards on the southeastern bank of the lake. It was surrounded by a palisade, and in it were constructed various shelters for the birds which were to populate it. These were simply built of branches and divided into compartments made ready for the expected guests. Pencroft scarecrows, Pencroft scarecrows. The first were the 2 tinamous, which were not long in having a number of young ones. They had for companions 6 ducks, accustomed to the borders of the lake. Some belonged to the Chinese species, of which the wings open like a fan, and which by the brilliancy of their plumage rival the golden pheasants. A few days afterwards, Herbert snared a couple of gallinaceae, with spreading tails composed of long feathers, magnificent electors, which soon became tame. As to pelicans, kingfishers, water hens, they came of themselves to the shores of the poultry yard, and this little community, after some disputes, cooing, screaming, clucking, ended by settling down peacefully, and increased in encouraging proportion for the future use of the colony. Cyrus Harding, wishing to complete his performance, established a pigeon house in a corner of the poultry yard. There he lodged a dozen of those pigeons which frequented the rocks of the plateau. These birds soon became accustomed to returning every evening to their new dwelling, and showed more disposition to domesticate themselves than their congeners, the wood pigeons. Lastly, the time had come for turning the balloon case to use, by cutting it up to make shirts and other articles. For as to keeping it in its present form, and risking themselves in a balloon filled with gas, above a sea of the limits of which they had no idea, it was not to be thought of. It was necessary to bring the case to Granite House, and the colonists employed themselves in rendering their heavy cart lighter and more manageable. But though they had a vehicle, the moving power was yet to be found. But did there not exist in the island some animal which might supply the place of the horse, ass, or ox? That was the question. Certainly, said Pencroft, a beast of burden would be very useful to us until the captain has made a steam cart, or even an engine, for some day we shall have a railroad from Granite House to Port Balloon, with a branch line to Mount Franklin. One day, the 23rd of December, Neb and Top were heard shouting and barking, each apparently trying who could make the most noise. The settlers, who were busy at the chimneys, ran, fearing some vexatious incident. What did they see? Two fine animals of a large size, who had imprudently ventured on the plateau when the bridges were open. One would have said they were horses, or at least donkeys, male and female, of a fine shape, dove-colored, the legs and tail white, striped with black on the head and neck. They advanced quietly without showing any uneasiness, and gazed at the men, in whom they could not as yet recognize their future masters. "These are onagas," cried Herbert, "animals something between the zebra and the kanaga." "Why not donkeys?" asked Neb. "Because they have not long ears, and their shape is more graceful." "Donkeys or horses," interrupted Pencroft, "they are moving powers, as the captain would say, and as such must be captured." The sailor, without frightening the animals, crept through the grass to the bridge over Creek Glycerine, lowered it, and the onagas were prisoners. Now should they seize them with violence and master them by force? No. It was decided that for a few days they should be allowed to roam freely about the plateau, where there was an abundance of grass, and the engineer immediately began to prepare a stable near the poultry yard, in which the onagas might find food, with a good litter, and shelter during the night. This done, the movements of the two magnificent creatures were left entirely free, and the settlers avoided even approaching them so as to terrify them. Several times, however, the onagas appeared to wish to leave the plateau, too confined for animals accustomed to the plains and forests. They were then seen following the water barrier which everywhere presented itself before them, uttering short neighs, then galloping through the grass, and becoming calmer, they would remain entire hours gazing at the woods, from which they were cut off forever. In the meantime, harness of vegetable fiber had been manufactured, and some days after the capture of the onagas, not only the cart was ready, but a straight road, or rather a cutting, had been made through the forests of the far west, from the angle of the Mersey to Port Balloon. The cart might then be driven there, and towards the end of December they tried the onagas for the first time. Pencroft had already coaxed the animals to come and eat out of his hand, and they allowed him to approach without making any difficulty, but once harnessed they reared, and could with difficulty be held in. However, it was not long before they submitted to this new service, for the onaga, being less refractory than the zebra, is frequently put in harness in the mountainous regions of southern Africa, and it has even been acclimatized in Europe, under zones of a relative coolness. On this day all the colony, except Pencroft, who walked at the animals' heads, mounted the cart, and set out on the road to Port Balloon. Of course they were jolted over the somewhat rough road, but the vehicle arrived without any accident, and was soon loaded with the case and rigging of the balloon. At 8 o'clock that evening, the cart, after passing over the Mersey Bridge, descended the left bank of the river and stopped on the beach. The onagas, being unharnessed, were thence led to their stable, and Pencroft, before going to sleep, gave vent to his feelings in a deep sigh of satisfaction that awoke all the echoes of Granite House. Chapter 8. Linen, shoes of seal leather, manufacture of pyroxyle, gardening, fishing turtle eggs, improvement of Master Jup, the corral Mussman hunt, new animal and vegetable possessions, recollections of their native land.